Okay, so let's answer some of the questions in discussion board 10. And uh, our first question is from Kacie. And she asks, going off my comments above, because there are more non-native speakers of English than native, do you think there are certain words that will change over time because of the accent and language difference in some non-native speakers? Are there any words or pronunciation of words that have already changed that you can think of? Um, well, one thing we have to say, of course, is all languages are perpetually changing. That is the dynamic of language. And we can also look at not just varieties of non-native English. We can also look at varieties of English like American, British, Australian, Indian, West Indian, for example, and we can see that there are quite a lot of differences in terms of vocabulary, differences in pronunciation, of course, and differences even in grammar. So what we can expect with ELF, English as a lingua franca of ELF, is that, and that's a variety of English spoken by non-native speakers, is it's going to develop its own particular pronunciations, words, and grammar. To give you some examples of that, this pronunciation is probably going to be simplified. So if you take two words in English, thanks and they, so the English word thanks when you thank somebody, and the English word they, the plural pronoun. The beginning sound of those two words is a TH combination. It's a very difficult consonant cluster for most students to master. It's very difficult. So instead of saying thanks, it can be simplified to tanks. Okay, and you've probably heard some dialects of English which actually use the word tanks instead of thanks. With they, we have a voiced sound, and that can be simplified to day. And you probably heard varieties of English use that particular. So that's a simplification of the pronunciation system. We're going to have a lot of that. We'll also have a simplification of the grammar, and if you think about it, there's some kind of crazy grammar in English, right? For example, you have that third person S. What's the use of it? So probably in non-native varieties, elf, we're probably going to have he liked pizza. Hey, and that's okay. Who cares? One other thing to mention there is that the one thing I've noticed in the writing of EFL students is the particular use of the verb to emphasize, followed by a preposition on, to emphasize on something, which I don't consider to be standard, but it's increasingly becoming standard, and it seems to be generated by EFL students from the patterning of the noun. So if you think of the noun emphasis, to put the emphasis on something, so you have noun plus preposition. Well, if you transfer that rule, if you generalize it to the actual verb, then you're going to put in a preposition, and that seems logical, and that seems to be happening quite a bit. So you're going to have those kinds of changes. Anthony says the text in chapter 26 on pages 515 to 517 discusses the idea of socially responsible teaching and how to deal with controversial issues. The guidelines seem to draw a fair and reasonable outline, but I can't help but envisaging challenges when discussing women's rights in the Middle East, for example, that not only bring up cultural differences, but religious ones as well. How would you handle a classroom that has a demographic composed of a mix of Western and Middle Eastern students, both men and women, or simply Middle Eastern students alone? Okay, well, I mean, it's going back to a lot of things about material production, is that material production should be based on your knowledge, both of yourself and who your students are. Okay, you can only create materials that you are enthusiastic about, and you can only create materials that are going to work if you know something about the students and how they're going to react to them. So if you learn about your students, then you might learn, or you might be comfortable with the students, that you could approach some of these issues. And of course, the benefit of these kinds of issues is that they can generate a lot of communication. But it all really depends on your knowledge of your class and what your class can tolerate. The other thing here is knowing yourself and what you're comfortable with. One of the things about language teaching is we very quickly realize that we do have a lot of culture that we bring into the classroom. Language really is inseparable from culture in many different ways. We can attempt to reduce it, for example, but even in scientific texts, there's still use of metaphors which reflect a particular culture. So before you wade in on any of these debates, examine your own prejudices, your own biases, because often when you begin to talk with people from different cultures, you get a totally different viewpoint. You yourself get a different viewpoint on what you took for granted in your particular culture. James, responding to Zaid, Zaid notes that two potential negative side effects of teaching culture include the following: invalidation of the L1 culture, which creates a defensive attitude amongst students and hostility to the target language; erosion of the students' beliefs in the worth of their L1 culture. Are there situations more likely to occur when a learner's target L2 is a lingua franca and their first language is not? Similarly, does the size of a language's culture have a relationship to these negative effects occurring? Well, the key thing here is the language they are learning a dominant language in terms of the world economy and culture, or economy dictates that it's going to be culturally important. If it has that combination of this is the language to get a job and this is the language which is cool because, hey, listen to all those hip hop singers that I really love, they are singing in English. So that's a powerful effect. But it doesn't have to be a lingua franca. It depends on the different situations. It's really whether it's a dominant language, whether it's a lingua franca or not. You can't measure culture in terms of size. Um, all languages are spoken within a culture which is as rich and varied as each other. Um, we can talk about the number of particular uh, books that have been written, dances that have been created, or paintings that have been painted, but that's a pretty crude measure of a culture. A culture is something in which a child is born and learns a set of rules and ways of behavior and doing things, which is important to the place and time in which they are. So that's powerful. So that's one of the problems. That's the kind of problem that a lot of students and this is the problem here. Are is there L1, for example, an endangered language? Is it a language which is spoken in a culture that has a lot of economic strength? Unfortunately, not. So if you think of some of those indigenous languages of the Aleutian Islands, part of the United States, um, there's a terrible erosion of those languages because young people can see that English is by far the most dominant language and say, hey, why should we keep on speaking our own language? Um, Okay, next question, Sarah. How can one incorporate the slang words that people actually hear in English conversations in a classroom where these are not exactly proper terms that would generally not be taught? Okay, the word slang is not a word that I, as a linguist, use. As a linguist, I use non-standard. And if you think of language as being non-standard, then you have to look at the particular context in which non-standard language is used. And if you look at those particular contexts, Are students going to be in those contexts? Therefore, that is a legitimate reason to teach those contexts and the languages that go with them. So, if they're going to be living in the dorms with an American roommate, then there's a lot of non-standard language used by students that are going to be, it's going to be appropriate to teach that student. But again, non-standard. What's the context in which it is spoken? Catherine says, in the chapter, the lecture, and the Zaid reading, the teaching of culture and how to respect different political and social ideas was discussed. I do believe that it's important to teach culture in a classroom. How can a person teach English culture? I don't know what you mean by English culture. You mean the culture of England? Be careful that you don't associate the culture with the language, because as we know, American culture is quite distinct from English culture, from Scottish culture, from Australian culture, from Nigerian culture, from West Indian culture. Is there a level where it becomes more appropriate to discuss political and social aspects of culture, not directly related to the language? For example, could you discuss these issues with a beginner level, or should you wait until the intermediate, of course, with the acknowledgement of age appropriateness? Well, it is possible to discuss these issues at a beginning level. It depends on the students and their particular motivation and their particular interests. Again, it all goes back to knowing who your students are and what motivates them and what would be interesting to them. So being a beginner shouldn't be really too much of a obstacle. Of course, more of an obstacle is their proficiency and ability to express their ideas. But certainly, if students are interested in particular topics, those are the topics that you should be addressing. Bailey says, I did wonder about one thing from the reading. The text encourages us to interact with our fellow teachers when abroad and seek out constructive criticism from, as well as have them observe our classes and inform us of what they think after the class is finished. If I go to a country like China, South Korea, or Japan, where I don't know the native language at all, how can I be expected to seek constructive criticism from fellow teachers if I take up a job as an EFL teacher in a school where none of the other teachers speak English? That's probably unlikely. You're probably going to find a certain amount of many teachers who are able to speak English and probably want to speak to you. But think also of native English speakers who are teaching in Japan, South Korea, China, who've been there a lot longer than you have. Those are the people who got a lot of important experience that they can pass on to you. So certainly encourage anyone, any teacher who's been in the country for a year or more, to come into your classrooms, because you'll find that really, really helpful, and you'll learn a lot, and you won't make the kinds of mistakes you'll regret later. Okay, that's all for discussion board 10. Okay, looking forward to discussion board 11.